If Final Fantasy 1 is a thing and Final Fantasy 2 is strange, then Final Fantasy 3 is definitely a time. Believe it or not, this is actually the first Final Fantasy game that I played. Way back in 2016 when I was bored one summer, I was asking a friend, I was like, hey, what Final Fantasy game should I get? And he was like, get 3 to 8. I'm like, okay. So then I went on, got it on Steam, and then tried out 3, because you know I want to start from the top. 3 was a strange experience for me. I was having a decent amount of fun with it, but the game was kicking my butt, and it was pretty clear that I really didn't understand much of what was going on while I was playing through it. I mean, I had played through like a good 3 or 4 hours of it, and I hadn't switched to a job yet. Just goes to show just how much I didn't understand the game's mechanics at the time. Ultimately, I ended up putting down the game for a good while because it's not so much that I couldn't get into it, but it was just pretty clear that it wasn't the time, if you will. Not exactly the greatest experience for your first Final Fantasy, but it's pretty clear things have changed, so now we're moving on to FF3. Now that I know what to expect from the series, I've gotta say, this game's got some really good ups, and it's got some really fascinating downs. FF3's story is remarkably weaker than the second's, so let's make a quick comparison for a moment. Let's go back to Final Fantasy 2. Starts off with a nation sparring with another nation, ends up being a conspired flank on the rest of the world. You play as 4 heroes. You are attacked and defeated right from the very start. A little shocking, actually. You're then put into a revival chamber, and after being revived, you notice that one of your friends is missing. You're then put out on missions with the ulterior motive to find your missing friend. Story never gets all that deep, but it's pretty competent, especially for an NES JRPG of that time. And even though the story is so simple, the purpose each character serves is done quite well, actually. Say what you want about the game's gameplay, I mean, it really isn't all that good. It's a little sucky, honestly, but the game wasn't all smoke. FF3's story it's something else. So you play as Luneth, a young orphaned adventurer. Without any context, you fall down a hole. So you go down this hole for a little bit, you look around, you know, fight a couple of goblins, some little sea creatures, plant monsters and stuff, you know, whatever. End up killing a big turtle. You meet a giant crystal that tells you that you, along with a few other people, are the warriors of light that are going to save this world. And you get a little nice prologue scene with the crystal and the credits and all that. Nothing special. But I mean, I suppose it's nice, but FF3's intro is definitely weak. At least when we consider the FF remake so far. FF1 didn't really have much of a story to it, but what I really liked about it was how it very much established a mood. And even with all of the peppy music, it was pretty clear this was a serious problem that we needed tending to. FF2 did it even better. I understand that FF2 did a lot of things wrong, but it seems like FF3 almost didn't want anything to do with it, even in regards to storytelling. Don't know if I really agree with that philosophy. And you're gonna see, the story doesn't get much better than this. In fact, depending on how you look at it, it actually kind of gets worse. It's quite unfortunate. So anyway, all you really need to know is that you play as Luneth, Ark, Rafia, and Ingus. Luneth being an adventurer, Ark being a scholar, Rafia being a novice blacksmith, and Ingus being the royal guard. Ingus is also my favorite character, kind of just because I just kind of like him. I just think he's pretty alright, pretty cool. But yeah, pretty straightforward stuff. So the visuals. There's a couple of changes and adjustments that I don't really care for too much in this remake. One of my biggest hangups being how the characters look in this game. They all have this identical, androgynous, somewhat bored look to them. Don't really know why that is. The easiest way to differentiate them is from their eye color and their hair and sometimes their expressions, but their expressions are mostly the same, so I would definitely say eye color and hair is what you should look for here. But in terms of aesthetics, don't really know why they went with this. It's really boring to look at. I mean, it looks like they're about to fall asleep on their own design. If we also look at FF3 Remake from a graphical standpoint, I would definitely say this is the worst one yet. And I'm not saying it looks incompetent, it really doesn't. It looks like care was put into it. But I mean, just look at the amount of detail that was pumped into FF1 and 2 Remake, and then look at FF3. I think one of the most noticeable differences is how black magic looks in this game. Just look at some of FF1's black magic effects, and then look at FF3's, and I mean, I guess you could say you like 3's more, but I mean... Don't really know why, it's definitely not as fun to look at. Another one of my hangouts with this game's visuals is that there are no high detail cutscenes. Don't know why. Actually, no, I do. We will get onto that in just a moment. But FF1 remakes, high detail cutscenes looked pretty nice. FF2 was even better. In fact, FF2 was like leagues ahead of FF1, and it looked fantastic. Something I never got tired of looking at. FF3, pretty much just gone, and that's a bit of a shame. Portraits are also missing in FF3, but I can kind of give them this one because since we're in a 3D environment, characters are a bit more animated visually on their models. So there's some compensation here, so I really can't knock that. But there is a reason for this lack of polish in the game's visuals. You see, FF3 Remake was originally supposed to be a PS2 game, and I really don't know all the details about it, but I know that at some point Nintendo came to Square Enix was like, hey, why don't you remake it on our Nintendo DS instead? So they started from scratch again, teamed up with Matrix Software, and it kind of speaks for itself. They had to cram what was originally a pretty big project on the PS2 and cram all that ambition into a system that was pretty early in its life. And granted, if we consider how this game looks compared to other young Nintendo DS games, that's actually pretty good, but still, there are consequences and we can see them. But ultimately, this doesn't ruin the experience of FF3, we have more important things to worry about. Before we get on to the more important stuff, the music. Must I even say it? Shocker, shocker, another golden soundtrack put out by Nobuo Uematsu. I probably botched that name a little bit, and I don't really care. But yeah, it's some seriously good stuff. My only complaint with the remake soundtrack might be that it's a little more conservative compared to the first two games with their remakes. There's noticeably less improv in FF3's remade soundtrack, but not that that's really a problem, that's a nitpick. I don't really care about that. It's still really, really good stuff. Some of these songs, I swear you could go to sleep to. Like, it's some lullaby music, man. Just listen to the submarine music. Now tell me you don't want to catch some Z's. The gameplay. This is where it shines. FF3 is kind of like FF1, but pretty roided up. So jobs are back. And we've got a lot more to work with than what we originally had. In fact, I can't even list all of these off the top of my head, and even if I could, it'd be needlessly padding out the video. So yeah, that should tell you something. So, surprise, surprise, Black Mage is still my favorite class in the game, and my composition was usually made up of Luneth being the Black Mage, Ark being the White Mage, Rafia being the Scholar, and my boy Ingus, what else than the Warrior? Come on now. The Black Mage is still about as effective as it was in FF1, debatably. FF3 makes some rebalancing changes we'll talk about in a little bit. The White Mage is a White Mage, does the job pretty good. The Scholar is pretty interesting. We'll talk about some strange design decisions that was made surrounding the Scholar. But what you really need to know, the Scholar can identify enemy data. And the Scholar is also very, very, very good at using magical items. I think that's actually a pretty cool gimmick. So the Scholar is almost like a Black Mage that can attack a limited amount of times throughout the entire experience. I'm talking like, say for random item drops, the Scholar can only attack like, what, 30 to 40 times throughout the entire game, which that's pretty limited, so you want to say the Scholar as a trump card, if you will. But the Warrior is just absolutely insane. The Warrior has this ability called Advance, which increases your damage, but I also read up that it also lowers your damage for like a turn or so you're a little more vulnerable. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, the Warrior's a little squishy for a class, but it doesn't really matter. Just heal them up, make sure that they're taken care of. But Advance hurts pretty bad, and it gets remarkably stronger, especially if you got the composition that I did near the end of the game. We'll talk about that. It's a little insane. The weapon proficiency system. Back from FF2, and a lot better than what it was. So you know how Final Fantasy II, with its weapon proficiency system, would pretty much lock you to one weapon type for the entire game? And if you ever wanted to go back and experiment, you couldn't really do that without really hindering the experience and having to grind up to that point. Really tedious, right? FF3 changes that. No longer do your stats pretty much drop to 0 when you want to try something new. You just get a little more effective every time. It's pretty nice, actually. I like how it was integrated in. So overall, it was made more accessible. And thankfully, magic doesn't suck in this game. Like, it actually works. So that's nice. But of course, all this good game design goodness comes at a cost. FF3 is quite hard. Now you could say that FF2 is harder, but Final Fantasy 2 was only hard for the fact that your health just wasn't leveling up properly, and once you get past that, that game was nothing. It was artificial at best if you ask me. But FF3 is just a hard game. Enemies are pretty good about tanking hits and hitting pretty hard, and punishing brain dead strategies. It's not like FF1 or 2 where you can kind of get away with just going in guns blazing and just walk away from the fight. FF3 doesn't really allow for that. In fact, I found out really quickly that you're gonna die kind of fast if that's all you ever do is just attack. FF3 introduces guarding. Trust me, treasure guarding. It is very, very useful, especially if someone you really don't want dying is about to die. It's even pretty effective against boss attacks, so yeah, that's pretty nice. Use guarding, it is very helpful. But FF3 doubles down. You can't save in dungeons anymore. No longer can you walk right before a boss and just cheese it. If you don't want to lose any progress, make sure that you leave a dungeon if you're feeling unsure. Now thankfully, you are given clues as to whether or not a boss is coming up. Often, the music will change when you enter a boss arena, or the area you entered has a very important look, if you will. You know, maybe the room is a little spacious, or you start seeing structures that look a little sophisticated. You know, like there was more thought put into it, if that makes sense. So the game will kind of ease you on, and you should use your judgment, but just know that it's really your fault if you lose all that progress. The level design is also some of my favorite yet. FF2 was already a pretty good step up from FF1, but 3 just makes it even better, especially since FF3 Remake is not locked to a grid like the first 2 games, so Square can actually get more creative with this. It's a little unfair to compare, but hey, it is what it is, it looks better. Also, still on the difficulty, we still got more double downing over here. Gil, the currency of the Final Fantasy universe, kinda hard to get in this game. Something that was quite gratifying, but honestly a little broken, was the fact that FF1 and 2, over time, would start to dump more and more cash into your pockets. Which means that, you know, once you start getting about halfway through the game, you can just kind of rush into a town, buy all the best stuff, and get out. 3 doesn't really play like that. You want that good weapon, you're probably gonna have to work to earn that good weapon. It doesn't really help that items in general are more expensive in FF3. So not only do you get less money, but everything costs more. You're gonna find really quickly that the most cash you'll find is from relatively rare enemies or bosses. They're usually gonna be your main source of finances. But I actually like this change. It's less brain dead, and it actually encourages that if you want it, you're gonna have to work for it. I think I have to say that FF3 easily has the best gameplay format so far. But of course, when it comes to all great things, there's always something. So the pacing of FF3 is kind of a nightmare, both in the gameplay and story department. Keep in mind, this is not really criticizing the gameplay formats of Final Fantasy III. The gameplay format is fine. In fact, it's fantastic and very rewarding. But it's how this game treats the format, if you will. Let me explain. So one thing you're going to notice if you play Final Fantasy III for long enough is that the game is ridiculously demanding. Oftentimes you're going to find that you have an illusion of choice throughout the experience. Even though you want to play one way, FF3 demands that you play this other way. And not like demand, it's like you pretty much can't beat the game if you don't play it this way. For example, the giant rat in the Nepto Cavern. So at one point in the game, you have to learn the spell Mini and then shrink yourself inside of this dungeon, because the dungeon is too cramped. And you're going to notice almost immediately that your attack damage is always locked at 1, for physical that is. Magic is still magic, it's fine, which makes sense. But once you get to the end of the Nepto Cavern, you're going to run into the giant rat boss, and you're probably going to get your butt handed to you a couple times. Because any physical attacks you have can't do jack squat, because their damage is 1, unless you consider 1 something, which I strongly doubt you do. This leaves my black mage to do all of the dirty work. Ingus can't do anything, and Rafia at the time was a monk, or whatever. I kept switching Rafia out, but I know she was a melee attacker, and she really couldn't do much of anything. And Ark is a white mage. I mean, what is he gonna do? So they'll let my man Lunith to do all the heavy lifting, and unfortunately that's not enough. We got whooped every time. So what I ended up finding out is that you pretty much have to switch classes at this point. So I switched everybody to a mage class, went back to the town of Kozus, which happened to have a secret fire rod there. So I got the fire rod, which is nice because when I switched to the mage class, they have to get used to that before they can start properly using magic at all, which would have been a huge pain. But the fire rod allows anybody who can use magic, that's eligible anyway, to use the fire rod and cast fire. And thankfully that includes the white mage as well, so everybody was a part of this. So I switched everyone to a mage class, went back to the rat, and just burned him to death with a fire rod over and over again. Later on, you run into a boss called Hein, who has a special quirk about him. He keeps switching his weak point. If you try to ignore this detail, you're going to get your butt whooped really quickly because his physical attack defense is somewhat high. In fact, I didn't attack with Ingus too much because even with advanced, the damage wasn't all that great, and Hein hits pretty hard, so I mostly had Ingus blocking for this fight. And you know I said earlier that the Scholar is the one that can identify weaknesses? You're going to need a Scholar for this fight. Before, I actually didn't have a Scholar. But after trying to, use my own methods of beating him, I couldn't do it, had to switch to a Scholar, and constantly identify his weakness, and then put the smackdown on him. And if you don't get bosses that have very specific requirements, you're kind of required to exploit their weakness. Like the boss Medusa, who has pretty good defense, and I was really confused for a long time and kind of frustrated until I found out that Medusa is very vulnerable to, I believe it is, ice damage? Either ice or lightning, can't quite remember, but I know it was either ice or lightning, and I had to keep exploiting that weakness. I wasn't really paying attention too much, but once it was brought to my attention, I noticed that once I exploited her weakness, she was taking notably more damage. I'm like, oh wait, because I'm just thinking that RNG is like, okay, more damage with this. No, she is weak to that. But yeah, again, kind of streamlining you into following a particular strategy. And then you have that one boss. Anybody that's played FF3 knows what I'm talking about, the Garuda, the one everyone gets stuck on, guaranteed the first time. Let's talk about FF3's combat rebalancing for a second. And trust me, we'll get back to the Garuda on this. So in the original Final Fantasy III, enemies can still attack in large numbers like they do in FF1 and 2. However, in FF3 Remake for the DS, having roughly 9 enemies on screen at a time was too much for the system. So it was dropped down to 4 enemies per fight. What did Square do to accommodate for this? We ended up with enemies that deal about twice the damage, take half damage, and more often than not, have the ability to attack 2 times in 1 turn. So you think for standard enemies, that might not be too bad, and it really isn't all that bad. They're pretty tough, but you can stomach through it. Bosses, though, are a different story. More often than not, the remake is usually easier than the original game. That's just usually how it is. But in terms of boss battles, FF3 is actually harder. That is strange. Because that double defense, double damage, and double attack rule applies to bosses. So, let's get back to the Garuda. So this guy has a punch attack that deals like, in the original game, like a good 200 damage or so. Lightning attack does about, 300 to 400 to all party members. Pretty dangerous stuff, but totally manageable. Just keep casting Kiraga on the rest of your party with your white mage. Hopefully you should have a white mage at this point. And you're also encouraged to use the Dragoon, which it doesn't seem like it's all that necessary for the original game, but, it helps out a whole lot if you use the Dragoon for the fight. The remake throws that out of the window. This fight is way, way harder in the remake. So yeah, like that, 200 damage per punch, now 400. That lightning damage, it was like 300 to 400. Yeah, say hello to 900 damage. And keep in mind, this guy has 2 attacks now. So that lightning damage, that lightning attack, he can do it twice. So if you somehow manage to stomach the first hit, you're not going to get past that second one. So this boss is almost purely RNG whether or not you'll beat it. So it's pretty rough. That's easily the worst boss fight in the entire game. This really sucks, and it makes me want FF3 on the PS2 even more because of this. Because the PS2, I'm sure, no, it can't handle 9 or more enemies. And the Steam version is nothing more than a port of the iOS version, which is a port of the DS version, and nothing was changed in these next 2 ports. But just speaking on terms of strange balancing, some classes near the end of FF3 are objectively better than others. And unfortunately, my favorite class, Black Mage, had to let it go near the end. I was hurt, really hurt. So the problem with Final Fantasy III is that you're allowed to experiment when the game says you can experiment. Otherwise, you're playing by that game's rules. So it's a little deceptive, I don't care for that too much. I've gotten stuck on certain parts of the game for a couple hours because I didn't play by the game's rules. But the thing is, these rules can be kind of quiet, if you will. You don't really notice them right off the rip. So do you see what I mean when I say that FF3 has a really good format, but the game handles that format in a strange way? The story is its own separate, huge mess. So the original Final Fantasy III didn't really have a story like FF1, which I guess in and of itself is really not a problem. Still, strange to make that step down from FF2, but hey, it's not like the series is obligated to stick by a narrative. I mean, the series started off as a D&D ripoff, so, fine, whatever. But the problem with FF3 Remake is that they try to make it deeper, but they also want to remain really conservative of the original narrative. So what you get is this story that plays it super, super safe. You're gonna notice if you play this game that characters really don't share much of their opinion on anything other than the fact that, like, Rafia doesn't like toads, but you know, okay, character arcs pretty much don't exist. FF2 didn't really have much of character arcs, more or less just kind of climaxes to a character's personal story, if you will. But still, more than what 3 did. I would say out of the 4 protagonists, the deepest the game ever gets is with the character arc, when he has a heart-to-heart with a character called Prince Alice. But even then, that's really not saying much at all. Honestly, 2 was more interesting in this department. The way the story progresses in Final Fantasy III Remake is also kind of weird. Plot critical moments just kind of bounce off the walls and they're going here and they're going there. For example, there's a character that you meet later on in the game called Aria. Aria is a priestess of the water crystal, and she needs to go to a sea dungeon so that she can see the water crystal, bless it, return its shine to the world, you know, all that goody goody two shoes Boy Scout stuff. Soon after this, she died. This is like 30 minutes after you meet her for the first time. The main antagonist of Final Fantasy III, Xandy, the guy is revealed when like a third of the game is left. It's not very good. And what kind of bothers me too is that Xandy technically isn't the main antagonist of Final Fantasy III. It's one of those there's always a bigger fish kind of situations. Another example, the Kingdom of Saronia. So when you approach the kingdom for the first time through your airship gets shot down by some cannons, I think. They don't really show too much into it, but that's what I presumed. You end up meeting a poor fellow by the name of Prince Alice, that we mentioned earlier actually. And he tells you that his dad kicked him out of the kingdom after he questioned his actions. So you go through this whole process of getting some equipment and getting ready to face his dad. Once you go into the main castle to talk with Alice's dad, Alice has a whole like 5-minute character arc in that time. Which, by the way, between the beginning and end of that time, Prince Alice's father has not been revealed to have a curse, and he kills himself because his love of his son triumphed over the curse, which enabled him to kill himself so that he didn't have to kill his son. Yeah, it's kind of weird. I mean, I guess that isn't like the worst example in this game, but it's definitely not something FF2 would try to pull. Maybe except for the I died and went to hell and back kind of thing. That was a little ham-fisted, but we're not going to talk about that. Honestly, the whole story arc that kind of hurt me the most was the Flooded Surface arc, because it started off genuinely interesting, and then it is thrown away. Now granted, this is something that was in the original game as well, so technically this is the original FF3's fault, but I don't care. This is just one big mess to begin with. It's just sloppy. So before the Flooded Surface arc, FF3 just kind of seems like another FF1, if you will. But eventually you get to leave this world, and you get to venture out and see that everything was a lie. The game already kind of eased you on with the fact that you were surrounded by clouds, but it's later confirmed, yeah, everything was not right. So the Flooded Surface throws the rest of the world in time, and this actually creates a very interesting scenario. So there's this character called Sid, and not Sid from FF2. This is another Sid. In fact, there's a couple Sids in the FF universe. You'll see this name quite often. But a character by the name of Sid reveals to the 4 Heroes of Light that they aren't of this world. They're from other continents. And he claimed that they were brought to the floating continent world 10 years ago. And this was after a disaster struck. The problem is, a later character, Une, says that this flooded surface has been around for thousands of years. So how is it that these kids were from other continents that technically weren't really there at that point? So this is really interesting. It is implied at this point that what Sid perceived as something that happened 10 years ago is actually foggy memory, and is not his fault. Because since he was in the flood, if you will, he had no perception of time. It seems to imply that this guy was floating around for thousands of years in what seemed like a couple of hours. I mean, I gotta say, that's actually a little spine-chilling. And you know what the biggest disappointment about this arc is? It lasts no longer than your time with Aria. Yeah, because after she gets killed and you kill the Kraken that killed her, the Flooded Surface arc is already over. The rest of the world comes into play. You don't hear that very foreboding, very sad music. I kind of got like Chrono Trigger chills from this. It was kind of creepy, and I kind of liked it. I wanted to see more of it. And for it to last only like 30 minutes is not doing it justice. I would have liked to explore a post-apocalyptic, time-frozen reality. That would have been kind of cool. I mean, what makes it even creepier is the fact that once the world is restored to its normal state, nobody seems to have even noticed that it happened. But the thing is, any interesting concepts that Final Fantasy III came up with was kind of just thrown out of the window. And that is very, very disappointing. because this game has a lot of potential, but I guess in what was an effort to try to dodge what FF2 did wrong, Square just kind of overreacted. And please don't look at this as me trying to put out that FF3's story is bad so that it has a big negative impact on the experience. I'm not really trying to say that at all. I mean, I've seen that a lot of Final Fantasy fans will say that a game is not good because the story wasn't good. I don't believe in that. FF3 is still a good game, at least at its absolute core. But I'm a pretty big advocate for stories that justify your journey. It's why I like stuff like a lot of Zelda game stories and Doom 2016 so much, because they give you reason for it. It's not really necessary at all. I mean, again, I really liked Final Fantasy 1 for what it was, but it's just the fact that Final Fantasy 3 made the effort, but they just played it so safe. So it puts me in a really uncomfortable mood. But please don't think for a second that this makes FF3 trash in my eyes. It really doesn't. So I suppose we should get on to the finale. So the aforementioned antagonist, Xande, has some ulterior motive to clouding the world in darkness. Turns out that several years ago, some magical dude named Noah, I don't really know too much about him, 3 apprentices, Doga, Une, and Xande were all given blessings. Doga got magic, Une got dreams, and Xande got mortality. That's a strange magic property to possess. But of course, Xande did not like this, so he decided that he wants to cloud the world in darkness and freeze time so that he can remain immortal. But unfortunately for him, in this effort to make himself immortal, he was corrupted by the very darkness he used to shroud the world. And this darkness manifested into a scary green female being called the Cloud of Darkness. You know, I don't know why, but this Cloud of Darkness lady really unsettles me. I mean, she's already has like a really unsettling design, but like something like genuinely creeps me out about her. I think this has to do with like maybe a dream I had as a little kid, because I had a bunch of like really surreal and strange dreams, and she almost looks like something out of a nightmare that I'd have as a kid. No joking here. But anyway, this guy Xande, beforehand, is hanging out in the Crystal Tower at the very top of it. The Crystal Tower is very painful. First of all, the recommended level was 60. I was level 43 when I got there. And before we move on, I have a confession that I'd like to make. I used a trainer a few times. Yeah, like a cheating device when playing through this game. That aforementioned Garuda? Yeah, I cheated on that fight. Made myself invincible. But I mean, well, to be honest, it's the Garuda. I mean, like, it is RNG whether or not you beat it. I just didn't feel like playing the RNG's game. And I did boost my levels a few times, actually. But in my defense, whatever dignity or integrity that I have left, I did this for the sake of my own time. Now, as of recording this, I'm currently out of college, but keep in mind I was still going to college during that time. And, you know, I didn't have time to sit on the game for like 6 or 7 hours every time and try to experiment around with it. I just didn't have that time. Plus, I don't really like grinding. I already told you guys that. Although, I did do something unforgivable. On a particularly late night, it was like 3 or 4 at night, or something like that. I was playing through the game. I was trying to go ahead and finish it up. I was pretty dang tired, as you might imagine. And I was able to get to the final boss through my blood, sweat, and tears, man. This stuff wasn't easy. And I could not beat the final boss for the life of me. And so, keep in mind, I was really tired, so I got a bit of a moment of weakness, and decided to cheese the finale. Just made myself invincible, and I'm like, forget it, I'll just beat it that way. That did not feel good at all. You know, the boosting thing I can do with a stable conscience. I mean, I'm just boosting myself ahead. I'm just trying to catch up with the game because I don't feel like stopping to grind, you know? That's just my thing. I don't really want to do that. But this, now that was straight up cheating, man. Like, I didn't even try to explore any possibilities that night. I was just like, forget it. I'll just go ahead and beat it. That's not cool. But the next day, I decided I need to fix this. So, I decided that I was going to beat this boss legitimately this time. And to force myself to do that, I deleted the footage of me cheating the fight. I would like to show it to you guys, but I don't have that footage anymore. I deleted it. So I realized that there were still options that I hadn't explored yet, of course. Like I just said a moment. So I switched my Black Mage to a Summoner, because the Summoner is objectively better than the Black Mage. I can't stand that. I hate that I even have to say that. I switched my White Mage to a Devout. Didn't really care. The Devout's just kind of a... this is gonna sound wrong, but a whiter White Mage, if you will. Pretty much does everything a White Mage does in terms of keeping their team safe and just does it better. Now, the Summoner is a little bit limited when you first start with them, but once you get their primary summons, some pretty good stuff. I went to 2 caverns in particular, and I defeated Bahamut, a dragon in the Final Fantasy universe, and the Leviathan, which gave me Leviathan and Mega Flare. Now, both of these attacks already deal more damage than anything the Black Mage could ever do, which again, that hurts my soul. But I can't lie, Mega Flare is kinda cool. So after getting some summons for my summoner, so that they could deal some insane damage, I went on a quest for the Ultima, the strongest sword in Final Fantasy III. So after questing around for a bit, doing some little side quests here and there, eventually I got it, and I gave it to Ingus. Keep in mind, Ingus is already a very lethal character with his Advance ability. So Advance was just shredding through people at this point. And then I had the nerve to go to the land of Eureka. Now, Eureka is really difficult, but it's a haven of a bunch of legendary weapons, which makes sense. I can understand that being ridiculously difficult for that reason. But in there is a weapon called the Ragnarok. This thing is not as amazing as the Ultima. Now, the Ultima not only has high damage, but it also boosts your stats by 20 points, which is huge in this game. Some of those stats boosted include Ingus's vitality. So not only does this dude hit harder, but he can take harder hits. So he's already getting pretty powerful. And then I give him another legendary weapon. So he has 2 legendaries, like in one hand and in another. No joke in here. Pretty much from this point forward, the guy wasn't doing anything less than like 10,000 damage. On the final boss as well, he was taking no prisoners. And unfortunately, that makes the rest of the Crystal Tower, as well as the next dungeon after that one, yeah, there's another one after the Crystal Tower, they both become jokes. So let's get on to it. So the World of Darkness was actually a pretty dang difficult dungeon before I made any renovations to my composition. The bosses have brutal magic abilities, they hit really hard, and you need to kill these 4 bosses in order to get to the final boss. If you do not kill these 4 bosses beforehand, your chances of winning are extremely low, because the Cloud of Darkness has something called Particle Beam. Particle Beam deals uncomfortably high damage. Like, you'll be lucky if you can survive the first hit. Really lucky if you can survive the first hit. And it hits everyone at that. But the World of Darkness, the dungeon itself, a cakewalk now. I had a summoner who could deal insane damage, and I had a warrior who just was roided up at this point. So I really don't have much to say on the World of Darkness. It was pretty hard before, but it ain't nothing now. Oh yeah, also, it doesn't help that every time you kill a boss in the World of Darkness, all of your stats recharge. In fact, that's a theme throughout Final Fantasy III period. When you kill a boss, they don't reset, they just go back to their maximum capacity for that moment. Including any EXP that increases your stats for that time, it goes all the way up again. So yeah, with a warrior and a summoner that basically recharged after every fight, World of Darkness was nothing. So let's get talking about the Cloud of Darkness then. Say hello to what was the boss I couldn't beat. It's kind of a similar story to the World of Darkness. Extremely brutal beforehand, pretty much a cakewalk now. I mean, she still hit pretty hard, but I can manage with that now. Especially Ingus, now that he had a sword that increased his freaking defense. So that was just not a problem for him. And everybody else was either dealing insane damage, or healing the rest of the team to the point where the damage is just nulled from the Cloud of Darkness. You know, fun fact, the Blood Sword from Final Fantasy II is in this game. And it's still pretty useful. But for the Cloud of Darkness, it's more important that you just get that damage racking up as opposed to using the Blood Sword, because the Blood Sword doesn't quite work how it does in FF2, because you no longer take that 16th of health every time. Because if it did that, then I would just pair up the Ultima and the Blood Sword and call it a day, but they nerfed that stat. It's gone now. So, I mean, I could have used it, but it really wasn't all that useful. I still stuck with the Ultima and the Ragnarok. That was still like the beastly combo right there. So, with my Devout healing everybody all the time, my Scholar either dropping her deadly magic or healing up everybody as well, on top of my Summoner just bombing the place, and my Warrior just going ape, we killed the Cloud of Darkness in roughly 6 minutes and 17 seconds. So after the Cloud of Darkness has what is easily the worst final boss death animation in the trilogy, you get this splash of text that pretty much gives you a rundown of how the world of Final Fantasy III works. Very, very similar to the lazy exposition dump that was done in FF1. I mean, it's okay, fine. But basically, in the world of Final Fantasy, it is bound to fall into conflict in another age. But in those desperate times, the heroes destined to save that world need to have hope in order to preserve peace. And yeah, that's just kind of it. It's just a little short exposition piece. Definitely nowhere near as long as FF1's, but I don't know. It's really no better, no worse. It's just kind of there. So anyway, after that, all the party members escape the world of darkness, come back, and everybody celebrates, you know, woohoo party. After dropping a bunch of friends back at their own homes because they came earlier to save you from this mirror that froze you because you looked at it or something like that. So everyone gets dropped off back at their homes, and you head back to Luneth and Ark's hometown, where everybody just kind of celebrates some more. You get a couple of very generic, haha, you did it, Luneth, wow, welcome back, you know, cool, you kill nasty vegetable lady, nice, good going. So after all of that, everybody looks up in the sky and they see the crystals have their light restored and they're just kind of glistening, and you sit there for like 20 seconds looking at a sparkling light, and then the screen fades to black. Yeah, that's the ending, no joke. And that, my friends, concludes the NES trilogy. So, to be honest with you, I'm slightly mixed about FF3, not as mixed as FF2, but still pretty mixed about FF3. Without a doubt, Final Fantasy III is a lot of fun. I like the challenge they pose there. It is a genuinely good game at heart. I mean, the job experimentation was pretty fun to mess around with. As you can see from my composition, it was pretty conservative, didn't really want to get out of my comfort zone all that much with it, but still, it's pretty cool that it's there, and I did like what I had to try out. I like that a lot of abilities and weapons were more unique in this game. I didn't even touch upon some of the weapons that could paralyze enemies. Again, you know, you got the good old blood sword, and items that can cast higher tiers of magic, and just all of that good stuff. You know, I can't think of everything off the top of my mind, but we had some pretty good weapons in this roster. And the combat itself is just more rewarding. It feels better to kill monsters. I mean, you would think with graphics and effects this sucky in a Final Fantasy game that, you know, like, alright, yeah, it's not as satisfying. No, not really. Just play it for yourself. I mean, not dissing the first two games at all. Well, actually, but not dissing Final Fantasy 1 at all. That's still a fantastic game. But the game is a cakewalk. This game isn't. It wanted to make some change, and I did like what they had to change at its core. But the game is a slog at times. Sometimes the game wants you to switch to a class that you just may not want to play. You know, it just may not be your type. But, uh-oh, too bad. Nobody cares. You gotta play that anyway. Some spots can be a little grindy in FF3 sometimes if certain strategies aren't followed. It's a little iffy here and there, but I have been told that you can beat both games without grinding once. So I presume it's just knowing what's vulnerable to what and just following that through. And these problems may seem a little small, and they really are, to be honest. But they're so prevalent, and that is the problem. The story, for as atrocious as it may be, is not something that can really ruin the experience. The biggest issue with Final Fantasy III is that it's one big beginner's trap, and it requires a lot of trial and error. I'm sure that with the right approach, you wouldn't even have to grind once because certain strategies are really just that dominant. If, for whatever reason, you, the viewer, are taking my word as to whether or not you should get the game, I wouldn't be too quick to say that you wouldn't like Final Fantasy III. There is a truly fantastic game under all of these problems, and its sophistication honestly is quite unmatched when compared to the first two games. I'll leave you with this question. With the issue of several prerequisites in mind, do you think that you dislike this game as a whole, or simply your first playthrough? The absolute unit!